Okay, good evening, everyone. Thank you for coming to join us this evening for a conversation to celebrate the publication of The Humble Lover by Edmund White with Bill Goldstein. And I am going to briefly introduce them both and then hand over to you for the conversation. And this is the third time you've done a conversation that's going to be on PCG Studio. I very much enjoyed A Saint from Texas during the middle of our first pandemic summer. That was really fun. So looking forward to hearing you both speaking again. And so just a brief introduction. So Edmund White is the author of many novels, including A Boy's Own Story, The Beautiful Room is Empty, The Farewell Symphony, and Our Young Man. His nonfiction includes City Boy, Inside a Pearl, and The Unpunished Vice, The Flaneur, a book about Paris, and many literary biographies and essays. Bill Goldstein is the founding editor of the New York Times book website. He reviews books and interviews authors for NBC's Weekend Today in New York, and he is also curator of public programs at Roosevelt House, the Public Policy Institute of New York's Hunter College. Bill is the author of The World Broke in Two, Virginia Woolf, T.S. Eliot, D.H. Lawrence, E.M. Forster, and the Year That Changed Literature. So I will hand over to you. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Dave. I'm pulling the wire into place. My forte. So Ed, thank you so much for doing this. I'm so pleased to be asked to do it. And it's our third event for 192 Books in Paula Cooper Gallery. And I think a countless number of interviews over our long literary lives together. So I've tried to come up with new questions. And since you keep writing new novels that provoke new questions and amazement, I think I have some things that we haven't yet talked about. But I know it's probably, I mean, since you didn't create this cover, I do want to draw attention to just the perfection of this cover and who did it. And even if we're not supposed to judge a book by its cover, how did you find this perfect cover for the book?
I didn't find it. I mean, the Bloomsbury did, and everybody asked me who did the cover, and it doesn't say.
I know, I was quite upset. I mean, an anonymous genius.
Yeah, I think it's really good.
So you can't get it from the artist, a signed painting or whatever it is, since you don't know who created it.
I'll have to ask around. I'm so incurious, but
well, I mean, the Humble Lover. Who is the humble lover in this book? There are so many lovers, and there is so much. I mean, it seems at the beginning that one character will be the humble lover, and yet humble begins to mean so many different things as so many different sexual relationships multiply, and so many switches of roles and switches of sexual preferences happen in the novel. I read the book with one idea at the beginning and no idea at the end.
Well, no, I think your first idea was probably the one I had in mind. Aldrich, who's an older man who's very rich and who lives in New York, and who falls in love with a young male ballet dancer, and becomes extremely involved with him.
I would say he does. So Aldrich, I mean, and I don't know if you had this in mind when you created that name or gave him that name, but I love how the name becomes Old Witch.
It sounded to me like a kind of an old New York name, you know.
So did the Old Witch sobriquet come to you
just like that,
like as you were writing?
Yeah.
And this relationship that he has with, I guess it's spelled August. I mean, very creatively, he was born in August, and so his parents gave him that name. But I guess it
He's
would be
French Canadian.
Auguste.
Yeah.
Auguste. So what does Aldrich call him in the intimacy of their bedroom?
I think Auguste, because that is his name.
And not Augie or anything like
No,
that.
no.
And so I was curious. I mean, since this ballet dancer Auguste is such a great dancer and seems to dance every role. I mean, he reminded me of a young Mardu Gorgeous. If you read that novel by
Yeah,
James McCord, the singer who could sing every single role from Erda to Violetta and Brunhilde and Norma. He seems to dance 6 times a weekend, always the most arduous roles. Are you a ballet lover, or do you only love ballet dancers?
No, I'm a balancing lover, and I see my friend Maxine Growski here in the audience, and she and I and our friend who passed away, David Calstone,
Mhm.
we was at the ballet, and even when I was a kid in my 20s, and they were still dancing at what was that called, the city center. Uh, I, the cheap seats were 98 cents, and I was counting out my pennies every night and wondering if I had 98 cents.
So the research, I mean, so the information about the dances and the sort of visual sense we get of all of these dances and what Balanchine was doing and what the dancers are doing, that came from your own love of it, not from any kind of research that you decided to do for this book.
Well, I love that book, Mr. B, who wrote that.
Oh, that was just published.
Yeah.
Yes. Oh,
I can't think of her name.
oh, she's a brilliant writer. She Apollo's Angels. Jennifer Homans.
Yeah. I mean, that book really helped me tremendously. And I thought it was such a brilliant book. Um, I don't know. I mean, I have nightmares that the Times is going to hire a reviewer who's a ballet critic who will say you got everything wrong.
Well, so you didn't answer anything about the ballet dancers, though. I mean, so your reverence, or you seem to have the same omniscient eye for Auguste's body and some other bodies in the book, as you do for Ruby's or Agon or the Prodigal Son. So let's talk a little bit about that.
Well, I had when I was in my 20s, I had affairs with two well-known dancers, and that was a lot of fun.
Well, I know you just told me before we began that you're writing a memoir, your sex memoir. So will we have more about those two dancers in that book, or is that as much as we're going to get?
I hadn't thought of that, but because I don't know. When I started this sex memoir 7 years ago, I thought, oh, this is something that will never be published. And then Bloomsbury said, we want to do that one next, not your novel.
Back and forth between fiction and nonfiction. So before we'll talk a little bit about that later. I know you told me you've written 35,000 words, so we're eager to have the next 100,000. But I wanted to talk about this book, the not so much the plot as uh, because of course one of the things that we begin with is the humble lover, the older man Aldwych, and his love or infatuation with desire for Auguste, although the desire is a very specific kind of desire. And so I'd like it if you can say a little bit about how the novel unfolds and the kinds of relationships that you're exploring here, because it's an almost chaste love that we begin with, and I would not say that by the end any specifics have been left out of the paragraphs.
But well, when I was in my 30s, I had an affair with a famous actor who wanted to have a chastity club because he felt he was sleeping around too much. So he would be willing to sleep with me, but not have sex, and which completely drove me mad because I desired him so much. But anyway, that was the idea is that Auguste can't sleep alone, and he just can't fall asleep if he's alone. So um, um, uh, Aldrich offers to, have the maid leave a glass of milk and a cheese sandwich every night, and then he can climb into bed and he won't touch him. So of course that drives him mad too. But anyway, that's like a lot of marriages.
I mean, one of the things that happens when Auguste the first time, I think, does sleep in the bed next to Aldwich's joy. I mean, he can't sleep for the joy of it, and what becomes interesting there, I mean, is the chastity that you're talking about actually draws them closer, because you get quite subtle about the kinds of jealousy that uh, that that anyone in any relationship is sort of willing to stand. I mean, it's not simply, oh, this person is sleeping with someone else. It's much richer and complicated, as I say. And so, if you could talk about a little bit about how you saw this relationship developing. Was it similar to what happened between you and the actor? Is this all your imagination of the humble lovers losing his humbleness?
With that famous actor, I would arrange, in those days pre-AIDS, I would arrange to have orgies, so that I could touch him in the midst of the melee of the bodies, even though he was my roommate. That's how desperate I was.
Orchestrating orgies
to get to touch him.
Right.
Anyway,
did you touch any of the other people there?
Oh yeah.
Okay.
Necessary. But I think like my friend Marilyn, who was my closest friend, who passed away 10 years ago, she used to say, if you're really in love with somebody, it's not that you have to have sex with them all the time. You just don't want them to have sex with anybody else.
Right, and that's an aperçu. That's an insight. I don't know. Insight seems too heavy, because novels, I don't think, should move from insight to insight. But you make that a deep part of Aldwich's sort of character. I mean, that he is willing to say that at the beginning. I mean, and then
he has to accept this, and then Auguste takes up with a very hunky lover called Pablo, but who is also very available to anybody, including to Aldrich. But and then Aldrich finally loses Auguste to a woman.
Yes, well, I was going to bring that up. That
I had a psychiatrist when I was in college who said, "Oh, it's very good that you are hanging out with theater people because they have a very plastic sexuality," meaning they can go with either way.
Because they're always acting. I mean, or
no, just that's the mores of the group. I mean, performers.
Right. I mean, what's so interesting about Auguste is that I mean, he seems to hold this great power over Aldrich. I mean, even to the extent that Aldrich, I mean, begins to sort of come out of his somewhat cosseted, idle life to try to create a ballet company. That, I mean, all of a sudden, this idle rich man is actually working the phones, and I mean, traveling to Europe and coming up with business plans. I mean, it was quite a surprise to see him functioning that way. So that's one surprise. I mean, that Auguste has this power over him. But then one of the most interesting things about Auguste is that his power over Aldrich seems to shift. I mean, in almost the same way that you're saying about the theatrical people who can move from one to the other. I mean, into a completely different role when he meets, or I mean, he's met, but sort of becomes involved with this woman named Ernestine, who is related, I mean, by marriage at least, to Aldrich, and who seems from the beginning to have sinister plans. I mean, she's
the sadist, and she tortures her husband too, but everybody. And there are such women
and men. I mean, so what I'm curious about, the the jigsaw puzzle almost, or the shifting pieces. It's not really a jigsaw puzzle of the relationships. I mean, we have in the beginning Auguste and Aldrich. We have a little hint, I mean, through the book, of an earlier life of love that may have been long in the past for Aldrich, and then we have Ernestine and her husband Bryce, and then Pablo and Auguste. All of this is happening very early in the book, so I'm not giving very much away. But then, as these things shift, when you begin a novel like this with all of the shifting relationships, do you know at the beginning what the bedmates or couples or thruples will be by the end, or does that come to you as you're writing?
It sort of comes to me as I'm writing, I think. I mean, Ian Forster said you should have a horizon that you're heading toward, but you should invent as on your way there. And I think that's what I do. But I mean, partly that you think, oh, gee, this novel needs a reboot. I mean, it's getting a little dull and predictable. So I guess I'll introduce some new complication.
And is that a character, or is that something that occurs to you? Oh, well, I didn't realize Ernestine might be capable of this. Or did you know from the beginning what she was capable of? Or
I kind of knew from the beginning, because if you recall, after we first meet her, when she goes home with her husband, she makes him lick her boots.
Yeah. Yes, it was quite an explicit scene of the removing of her boots, and what's going on with her toes. So it felt to me very much like in many of your books. I mean, the revelation of character comes through the revelation of their sexual desires, not even that the acts are necessarily as important as the emotions that they're having during it. And you get to know these characters. This was certainly true in A Previous Life and in A Saint from Texas. I mean, even just talking about the most recent books, where the sexual explicitness comes to reveal who these people are, not simply to have them be in bed or not in bed with other people. I mean, is that something again that you plan out, or how do you know that these?
I have a sort of, I mean, I feel like people complain or like that I depending on their nature, whether I have too much sex in my books, but I think that I always say it's not pornography, because pornography isn't humorous, for
Right.
one thing, and for another thing, it's not really character revealing. I mean, the people are kind of ciphers who just move through their activities at the rate, and there has to be a payoff at the end of an orgasm for the readers, one-handed reading. And I think that my books don't do that. I mean, I suppose somebody has gotten excited over some scenes, but most of them are supposed to show what the people are like and what they want, and or they're surprised themselves by what they want.
Well, one of the interesting things is that, I mean, you're speaking of pornography, and then I'd like to get to the humor too, is that we learn in a couple of instances of the pornography that is particularly appealing to some of the individuals, and what they watch on Pornhub and why. And so I think you do get the sense that the utilitarian nature of their pornography consumption is very different from what's going on in their actual lives and in the pages of the novel. I don't like to use the phrase since, but seems somehow in service of something larger in your book, even though most of the people seem to be in service to some of the other people in the novel. So,
Well, yeah, I mean, I think that I think yeah, I mean, for instance, when Aldrich is in France trying to run down a famous choreographer to get him to come and work with his new company. Uh, he and in the hotel
right.
he looks at the available porn and I describe it. I mean, see, nobody else would describe that, but I always describe. Like when I lived in Paris, the French people used to always tease me for describing Paris. I mean, because they would just say, "Oh, he went to the Pont Neuf," but I say what it looks like. I guess I'm a literal minded in that way, but I always describe everything.
Well, let's talk a little bit about the comedy and the tragedy, because at the from the beginning, I mean, you feel that things are not necessarily going to go well for Aldwych and Auguste. I mean, just the inequality of it, or and and the almost inherent isolation of each person, even though they're with the other, and then come to a kind of wonderful um, uh, entente somehow. I mean, they live together so wonderfully, but there is this uh, sadness, and partly it's Aldwych feeling his age, and yet there's great wit on every page too. And so I wonder if lines like, there's this great line where uh, he's been introducing people or talking about Auguste as his nephew. And I guess this had led to one encounter with a different young man where he introduces him to a rival queen, I think you refer to it, and you say, "Oh, well, this is my nephew." He said, "Oh, I know, he was my nephew last year."
Yeah, but my friend Bernard Minaret, who had the last salon in Paris, uh, that he actually told me that joke.
Oh, well, I love how your friend Marilyn says something. Your friend Bernard. I mean, are you a sort of vacuum and
Magpie.
a magpie? And so some of these are things that, I mean, if you said he said it to you a long time ago, Marilyn died 10 years ago. I'm quite moved by the way these these lines, these things live in your memory and then come to shape something that you're actually writing.
Yeah, Bernard was incredibly witty because, like, he met this woman who was of a certain age, and she said, "I don't like gay people," and of course, not knowing that he was gay, and he said, "That's too bad, Madame. That's your future." C'est votre avenir, Madame.
You have to use that. And do you write things down as they're happening? I mean,
No,
so
I
this
don't
just,
keep a diary. No.
you don't keep any kind of diary or
Mm.
write these in a notebook where you might use them in 10 years.
But after I take my Ambien every night, I get bright ideas, or in the shower. Actually, the shower is the only place where I ever actually think. But but anyway,
How long a shower do you take every morning?
not very long, but I write down little notes on cards, which I leave next to my computer of things I'm going to write about. Sometimes I can't even figure what it is. I can't read my own writing, and I guess I was too stoned when I wrote it. But anyway, oftentimes lines will come to me, and I'll think, oh, I have to use that someplace.
Well, so when we were talking a bit about the comedy, but the tragedy too. I mean, you say how when you're writing, uh, you'll feel, oh, well, things are getting a little dull. I have to, change things up or add things in or do something different now. Are you, as you write or as you reread what you've written, do you feel that you have to modulate between the comedy and the tragedy? I mean, or do you feel? I mean, in this book, it seems to me that even what's comic, you sense, as I said, that something is doomed. I mean, the doom comes in a completely different way from anything we might expect. But if you are shifting things on the go, do you also shift the tone? How does that work for you to maintain and yet differentiate?
I just did an interview with Damon Galgut, who won the Booker Prize 2 years ago, and it's in pub lit pub lit pub, and anyway, in that he says that I praised him because I said, you're always so unpredictable. If you read the first 4 words of a sentence and then put your hand over the rest of it, you never can guess what the rest of it's going to be. And and he said, well, I remember that I read once that Tom Stoppard said that he wanted to ambush the audience. I mean, that is to upset their expectations. And I guess that's something I do too. I try.
So I wanted to ask. I mean, the the character of Aldwych is a man roughly your age, slightly, in your decade. I think you don't quite come from the same kind of old family with money. But when you're writing either Auguste or Ernestine or there's a wonderful character named Zaza. I mean, it seems to me that some of the autobiography of emotion is sort of displaced among all these people. But uh, how do you sort of deal? I mean, in writing about a man in his 80s, I mean, a gay man in his 80s, I mean, do you either welcome the idea that everything you're saying about that character might be read as autobiographical, or do you differentiate it? Do you differentiate him? Do you revel in revealing things about yourself?
I think I am kind of a literary exhibitionist. In real life, I'm not. I when people will bring up things in my novels, I blush because I don't want to talk about them. But I love writing about them and revealing everything. But no, I mean there was a character in a previous life
Yes.
who was called Edmund White, and that was as close as a portrait as I could get. Aldwych is sort of based on an old office mate I used to have at Time Magazine, who was a New York aristocrat and who lived in a townhouse with his mother, and he was very grand and I think he looked down on me, but I was very anthropologically, I was very interested in him. Even the way he pronounced words, like upper class people say, in a way, not anyway.
Oh, I loved that when you talk about the pronunciation there and how even the same character might shift. How they're pronouncing it. Depending on who they're
Who
with.
they're with, yeah,
Yeah. So
yeah.
well, the reason I asked that about autobiographies. I mean, I didn't think that it was an autobiographical character, but I noticed there are certain little characteristics that I wondered about in you. I mean, you have Aldwych reading Nothing by Henry Green, and
Which is my favorite book.
yeah, so that's one
Yeah,
thing I
yeah.
wondered. And do you read it every year as you have Aldwych
Yeah,
do?
yeah.
I liked that you had August, ask, well, what are you reading? And of course, he doesn't know what it is. And then he's slightly mystified that you would read it every
Yeah.
year. But what do you love about that book and what do you love about Henry Green?
Oh, Henry Green, I think, is the great comic author, and and he he was actually upper class. I mean, he owned a factory, and Henry Green was a pen name, but his especially his female characters are just a riot the way they rattle on, and I, there was an American writer um, called um, I'm trying to think of his name, but he wrote a book called um, I'm sorry, but there was an American writer who copied his style very successfully. Uh, 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 yeah, Armful of Warm Girl.
Spackman,
W.
W.
Spackman.
Spackman.
Yeah, and I went with two of my women friends who were in publishing to Princeton where Spackman lived, and we went there in the 70s to present our homage to him. But but he literally had a mad woman in the attic, and when she started making noises, he kind of went crazy, and there was a heavy duty nurse called Clarice who 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 took him out of harm's way.
Oh, well, that's quite specific. I wonder if Thomas Harris got Clarice Starling from having paid homage to W.H. Spockman and then found his nurse was called Clarice. It's not a name you hear too often
No.
outside of Silence of the Lambs. So, what we were saying then is other things. I mean, I noticed that you have Aldrich remembering, feeling that Auguste is one of the great loves of his life, if not the great or among them. I think he becomes Ernestine's great love. And you never really know what people mean when they say that, really. I mean, because they don't seem to have really investigated the question themselves somehow. I mean, what the great love is in their life.
In my sex memoir, I just wrote about this boy that I was in love with in the 60s called Jim Ruddy. And I said, he was the great love of my life, which I've always said. But then I was thinking how there are just a few scratches left on the amygdala that from all these years later that remember him, what he looked like, what he felt like, smelled like, and what he said. He was very intellectual, but I do remember that I had to write a book review of Paradiso by Jose Lezama Lima for the New York Times, and which is about like somebody handed you Ulysses by James Joyce and said, please give us 900 words in 2 weeks. Because it was such a complicated book. But Jim, the great love of my life, was a comp lit major and knew everything. And so he helped me, and I actually sounded kind of intelligent.
Oh, so you're still in touch with him?
No, he's dead. But
He helped you. Oh, this was a long
years
time
ago,
ago that you were.
yeah.
Oh, I thought recently you had to
No.
write this review. So that's one of the things I meant. I mean, you give his name. I mean, when Aldrich is thinking of this past, and he's not a person consumed by the past, which is also quite wonderful about him. But in that paragraph, I mean, you give several names, and knowing you for at least the length of time that I do, I know that even though that's the only last name you also give, I mean that some of the first names rang a bell with me. I mean, so in those ways, like Henry Green, in the names, the first names of these men, you do put yourself into the books.
it's just a reflex, I suppose. I mean, you have to think up some details to put into a novel, and I could often just grab the ones that are at hand.
Well, that was very moving. I mean, and then the other thing about this novel in particular is it seems very present day, and yet there's almost no specific mention of any particular time. And then there are a couple of hints that it's actually taking place in the present moment. I mean, there you use the word deplorables, which not in an election losing kind of way, unfortunately, but you do refer to deplorables. And then Cafe Luxembourg has a COVID cafe. I mean, so I'm curious about, for you, you were talking about how specific you might be about, what Paris looks like, something that other people might take for granted, or the specific things that we're seeing in the ballets here. Do you have in mind the moment at which it's taking place, or was that accidental that those then appear, but you didn't really mean to set it in our moment?
Well, since I'm 83 years old, I can it's hard for me to set something in the present, although my young husband can help me sometimes. But anyway, because I don't know that many details, and so it was convenient for me to have a character who was my age and who wasn't really hip about what's happening now, but actually have some details that indicated that was happening now.
Well, I also like, he does seem to. I mean, I thought it was very refreshing in the book. I mean, there does seem to be sort of modern slang that, I mean, if you say you're 83 and you're not hearing it, I don't know if Michael is giving it to you, or you're looking it up on the internet, but it felt very natural, not laid over.
Well, that's good.
MSNBC. So when I just before we began, I paid you the compliment of how much I loved this book, and I mean, you just said you're 83, so I can repeat that without having to specify your age on my own. But what I'm so astounded by this book, and by a previous life, and then also A Saint from Texas, is that so many people over the years, I mean, the last decades, have talked about the late novels of Saul Bellow. I mean, like what a resurgence he made in the late 80s into the 90s. I mean, he died, I think, in 2005. And then the last few novels of Philip Roth, I mean, culminating in Nemesis, which was his last book in 2010. So the praise for these late novels, and men writing in their 70s and 80s, I mean, these three books in particular seem to me to be the equal of those, if not even more alive, certainly with emotion, and I don't know if it's I mean, we don't want to say pornography, but the explicitness of the joy in the language, even when people are not always joyful in their sex lives or in the relationships that you're describing. There seems a great joy in the writing. And I mean, is that something that you feel you are aware of as you're writing, or is it something that I don't feel like I'm an 83-year-old man writing? I've forgotten that I am, or did you?
Well, it helps to be broke. I mean, we live hand to mouth, and so that is a good impetus for writing, and also um, Michael makes my life very easy because he does all the shopping and cooking and everything, and so all I have to do is just sit there and scribble.
But the sheer imagination of some of the situations. I mean, I'm thinking in a previous life. I mean, one of the things that stunned me when I was reading it is that so many of your books have like the Farewell Symphony, or in particular, have this feeling of unfolding in a kind of real time, but without a kind of forced plot imposed upon the flow. And what was so amazing about A Previous Life was the complicated intricacy of the structure. I mean, whereas a novel like The Farewell Symphony has an overall structure, but it's not a puzzle in that way. And so the sheer imagination and ingenuity of the construction seemed something different for you. I mean, in a lot of ways. And so the inventiveness and the imagination of the structure of that novel, and then in A Saint from Texas, just what you have unfold for these women. I mean, as the novel just keeps revealing more and more, it's just sort of an astounding imagination and richness. There's
Gee.
nothing.
I wish you would write the review.
Well, maybe I should dictate it. I mean, I guess what I'm trying to get at is
No,
that
I used to feel that I wrote autobiographical fiction, and that was kind of my specialty. But I've sort of gotten tired of saying I, and so then when you start writing about other people, and actually people that who may be slightly based on real people, but who are pretty much inventions, uh, then I always felt like I wasn't writing real fiction. That real fiction would have a plot, and that real fiction would have imagined characters and all that. And so I I feel like I finally learned how to write
Mhm.
after 30 books.
Learned how to write in the sense of finding something in yourself that you're liberating, or that you actually know going in how you want to do something.
No, I mean, like, I'm probably embarrassing Michael by referring to it, but he's always pushed me toward plot
Mhm.
and dialogue. And I remember one of my books, the reviewer, Caracole, the reviewer said, "This book is under aerated with dialogue," and Michael has pushed me toward plot and dialogue, and I think that has made a substantial difference.
Well, yes, I mean, so much happens, is revealed not only in the sexcapades of the characters, but also in the dialogue, which I always think is, I mean, it's the hallmark of my favorite writers. Like Trollope does that. I mean, the plots unfold through dialogue that is very specifically moving the story forward. There are no, I mean, even in a novelist is often prolix as Trollope. I mean, there are no words wasted in dialogue to just be placeholders. They're really moving either the character or the plot forward. So
Elizabeth Bowen, whom I vastly admire, wrote some notes on fiction for writers, and one of them was like, and that characters should be either in conflict with themselves or with each other, and that dialogue should always push the action forward.
So before we go to questions from the audience, I have a few questions I wanted to ask you, just sort of whatever comes off the top of your head, because you mentioned that you've written 30 books. I mean, I don't know if it's exactly 30 or 32. I've read most of them. I like to believe. I mean, I think I have. But I wanted to ask you, so in talking about that number, which is the book that you think is most representative of you? If aside from The Humble Lover, you told someone to read only one book that you'd written.
I guess A Boy's Own Story. I mean, Michael has just turned it into a graphic novel, and with and which is a beautiful thing to look at. And anyway, that seems to be the book that most people uh, identify me with. My favorite book of mine is Hotel de Dream.
About Stephen Crane.
Yeah.
Yeah. A wonderful book. I mean, the one of the other questions I wanted to ask, because I was going to raise the graphic novel version of A Boy's Own Story, is when you look back at your books, is there one in particular that you think, oh, I really wish I had the chance now to revise it, because in so many ways the graphic novel version was not just well, I mean, I really literal adaptation could not possibly be true since it's a graphic novel adaptation. But the book is changed, and the perspective you use, or Michael and the artist whose name is Brian, but I don't remember his last name.
Brian Alexander was another writer,
Oh, co-adapter. Sorry.
and the Igor
Oh,
Koresh, who's a Russian living in St. Louis, was the artist.
okay. So it's revised to reflect that this graphic novel was created in 2022. I mean, and so there are incidences and perspectives in the drawing that give us the sense of time having passed since these events, even more than 1982, looking back on this boy. Is there a book that you've looked at or thought, oh, God, I wish I could do that a little differently, and this is what I would do?
I actually like all my books.
Okay. Well, Michael, you'll have to adapt something else into a graphic novel and change it completely. And is there a book that you, other than Hotel de Dream, I mean, which you said is your favorite, is there a book that you think people misunderstood and you wish
Oh,
could be
well,
looked at?
my biggest flop was Caracole, and which is completely forgotten. Nobody's ever read it, but it's. I mean, it's. I think my most quotable book, and and in a way the most fanciful. Uh, I guess I was very inspired by Julian Grach, and in his book The Farther Shore, and also I was influenced by Nabokov's uh, failure of a book, Ada.
Mhm.
It's my own failure based on his failure.
And that book appeared, I think, in 1985. Is that right?
Sounds right. Yeah.
And so it's 40 years. I mean, now it's 2023. You moved to France in 1983, I believe, and I guess if you could just say something about sort of what you moved to France to do, and what you thought that time was going to be in your life, and now looking back 40 years later, was the move the change that you wanted, needed? Are you glad that you left the United States?
Oh yes. I mean, like I was the first president of the gay men's health crisis, and I hated myself in that role because I was sort of dictatorial. I'd say, "Oh, shut up and vote," and that kind of thing. And I thought, I really can't keep on doing this, and so I and I moved, and I had a wonderful time in France. Uh, my favorite picture, which I'm going to have enlarged, is of me and Michel Foucault hugging each other, it was. I really had a great time, and my best friend, Mary Claude de Bruno, whom I write about, whom I met through Maxine Growski at one of your parties, and anyway, she certainly made my life wonderful there. I mean, I think like if you have friends who are very social and who invite you around, like at Princeton, where I taught for 20 years, Joyce Carol Oates was like that.
Mhm.
She's always organizing an evening or something. And, and she would always include me. And that was wonderful. I mean, you just need one person like that in your life.
And you've had obviously a number in
Yeah.
different situations. Before we go to the questions for the audience, I mean, can you tell us a little bit about the 35,000 words of the sex memoir that you've been writing for 7 years, just so we know what to look forward to when your next book is published?
Well, I have portraits of some people, and then I have subjects like sadomasochism or having sex in weird places, or you know, my college lover,
Mhm.
and um, I'm trying to think what are some of the other themes, but anyway.
I'm not sure if you're looking at Michael to see if you should stop talking or for
No, I thought you might have
for
some
hints.
idea. But anyway, yeah, and that I think that yeah, either I write about a topic or a person.
Mhm.
Well, I mean, obviously the topic involves people.
Well, anyone who is curious about the sadomasochism chapter in that book will find that much of The Humble Lover is a prologue.
Which, by the way, bores me completely now. I can't understand how I ever was interested in it. But I mean, it used to be the most exciting thing. Now it bores me.
Well, it doesn't bore in the novel,
Oh, good.
so maybe you needed a little distance on it
Right,
to get everything across for the reader. So I think we have time for questions. I can repeat them since I don't know if there's a microphone going around. But okay, so I'll repeat the questions. Do you have questions? Any hands? Up. In the sex memoir. I mean, in the.
I think I do. I mean, people who are dead. I mean, because they can't sue you except in Mexico. The dead can sue you in Mexico. The family of dead people can sue you.
So you won't have any Mexican
No
lovers in the
Mexican.
book. Okay. Well, we know what we'll have to read posthumous. Can dead people sue posthumous authors? I mean, if this is left behind you, I mean, it's a very
Maybe
interesting
that would
theoretical
be,
question.
one dead in
Yeah.
a,
So,
I mean, that would be very American for one dead person to sue another dead person.
dead person. Other questions? Have I asked all the questions people have of Edmund White? Please.
When you wrote Our Young Man, were you spending a lot of time with Byron?
I have spent a lot of time in Fire Island over the years, and my first novel, Forgetting Elena, is really about Fire Island, or at least it's sort of set on Fire Island. And I've written quite a bit about it. Uh, I mean, actually, Our Young Man was inspired by a novel by Daudet uh, uh, called, what's it called? Yeah. Anyway,
The questioner can do the research.
Yeah, right.
Novel by Daudet.
Yeah. Um, it's called Sappho, and it's not about lesbians, but it's about a young man who comes to Paris and who's a penniless aristocrat from the South, and who meets a woman that he thinks is a working class woman, and is his age, but in fact she was a grande cocotte, and she's twice his age, but still looks really good, and is pretending to be working class, but is actually very rich from her years of conquests of various kings and so on. Anyway, um, and so I thought it'd be fun to base a gay novel on that. And I remember, like, a French friend of mine, René de Sacati, I told him I was doing this, and he was so disappointed that it really wasn't about Daudet and that period, but that it was about now.
Any other questions? If there are no other questions, now that you mentioned that you had based Our Young Man on this other novel, I mean, one of the things that was so surprising about The Humble Lover is, you begin at sort of thinking, oh, this is going to be Death in Venice, or that kind of abasement. Was that in your mind, at least as something you wanted to write differently?
Which was a very influential book. I must have read it when I was 12, and I love that book, and I love the book that Colm Toybean wrote recently about
The Magician.
The Magician. I mean, and his account of Amon apparently was gay, but never acted on it.
So, well, you can't say that about Edmund White. And I guess on that note, thank you, Edmund White. And I think you will be signing books. I'll get up from this chair and leave you to that business.
Thank you so
Oh,
much.
no, my pleasure. Thank you.
You're great. Oh, thank you.
Thank you, everyone, for joining us. You can get books at the front desk.
What's your name?
My name is Eric. Make it happen. H-E-I-N-K.
H-E